September 1, 1939. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Westerplatte Peninsula in Poland. With those first shots, the world plunged into the deadliest conflict in human history. Over the next 6 years, more than 70 million people would lose their lives. Nations would rise and fall. The very fabric of civilization would be tested to its breaking point. This is the complete story of World War II. To understand World War II, we must first understand how World War I ended. November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent across Europe, but the peace that followed would prove to be merely an armistice in a longer, more terrible conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire had been proclaimed 48 years earlier, was designed to ensure that Germany could never again threaten world peace. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, placed full responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies. Germany lost 13% of its European territory. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. The Polish corridor gave Poland access to the sea, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. The Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarized. But perhaps most crushing of all were the reparations. Germany was ordered to pay the equivalent of $442 billion in today's currency. For a nation already devastated by 4 years of total war, these payments would prove impossible to meet and would fuel the resentment that would later be exploited by extremist movements. In Italy, Benito Mussolini capitalized on post-war chaos and fear of communism. His black shirts marched on Rome in October 1922, and King Victor Emmanuel III, rather than use the army to stop them, invited Mussolini to form a government. Thus was born the world's first fascist state. Fascism promised strength where democracy seemed weak, order where there was chaos, and national glory where there was humiliation. It was a seductive message for nations struggling with the aftermath of war and economic depression. In Germany, a failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler joined a small political group called the German Workers' Party in 1919. By 1921, he had taken control of what was now called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Hitler's charismatic speaking and his party's violent tactics gradually gained attention, culminating in the failed beer hall putsch in Munich on November 8, 1923. Hitler's trial for treason became a propaganda victory. His 24-day trial was covered extensively by the press, giving him a national platform for his ideas. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, he served only 9 months, during which he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf to his cellmate Rudolf Hess. October 24, 1929. Black Thursday. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed, triggering a global economic catastrophe. By 1932, industrial production had fallen by 40% worldwide. In Germany, unemployment reached 6 million, nearly 30% of the workforce. Democratic governments seemed helpless against the crisis. In Germany, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning's austerity measures only deepened the depression. The Weimar Republic, already weakened by political fragmentation and the burden of Versailles, began to crumble. The Nazis exploited this crisis masterfully. In the 1930 elections, they won 18.3% of the vote, becoming the second-largest party in the Reichstag. Their brown-shirt SA paramilitary fought bloody street battles with communists, creating an atmosphere of chaos that made their promises of order more appealing. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in Germany, though they never won a majority in a free election. President Hindenburg, the aging World War I hero, was convinced by conservative politicians that they could use Hitler and control him. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. It was a fatal miscalculation. Within weeks of taking power, Hitler began dismantling German democracy. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided the perfect pretext. Whether the Nazis started the fire themselves or merely exploited a lone arsonist's action remains debated, but Hitler's response was swift and devastating. The decree for the protection of people and states suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents without warrant. Thousands of communists, socialists, and other enemies of the regime were detained in hastily constructed concentration camps. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933, gave Hitler dictatorial powers. Only the Social Democrats voted against it, the Communists had already been banned, and the Catholic Center Party was intimidated into supporting it. But Hitler's revolution was not yet complete. The SA, the brown-shirt street fighters who had brought him to power, now numbered 4 million men and were becoming a threat to his authority. On the night of June 30th, 1934, in the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the SS to murder SA leader Ernst Röhm and hundreds of other SA officials. The message was clear: Hitler would tolerate no rivals. While Hitler consolidated power at home, he began preparing for war abroad. In 1935, Germany announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, violating the Treaty of Versailles. Conscription was reintroduced, and the German army began its rapid expansion. March 7, 1936. German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France. It was Hitler's first major gamble in foreign policy, and he later admitted that if France had responded militarily, Germany would have been forced to withdraw. But France, politically divided and militarily unprepared, did nothing. Britain, viewing the Rhineland as Germany's backyard, was content to let the violation slide. The Spanish Civil War, which began in July 1936, provided Hitler and Mussolini with an opportunity to test their new weapons and tactics. The German Condor Legion and Italian forces supported Francisco Franco's nationalist forces against the Republican government. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, shocked the world and provided a terrifying preview of what modern warfare could unleash upon civilian populations. Hitler's next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, where 3.5 million ethnic Germans lived under Czech rule. The Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein and funded by Berlin, agitated for autonomy and eventually union with Germany. As tensions escalated through the summer of 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made 3 desperate trips to Germany to negotiate with Hitler. The Munich Conference on September 29 to 30th, 1938, attended by Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, sealed Czechoslovakia's fate. The Czechs themselves were not even invited to the conference that dismembered their country. Chamberlain returned to London believing he had secured peace for our time. The policy of appeasement, designed to satisfy Hitler's legitimate demands and avoid war, had instead only emboldened him. On March 15, 1939, German troops marched into Prague, occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. Hitler had broken his word given at Munich, proving that his ambitions extended far beyond merely incorporating ethnic Germans into the Reich. The illusion that Hitler could be appeased was finally shattered. August 23, 1939. The world was stunned by the announcement of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Hitler and Stalin, ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, had agreed to divide Poland between them. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact carved up Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler felt free to attack Poland. Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence in March 1939, but Hitler gambled that they would not actually fight for a distant Eastern European nation. On the evening of August 31, 1939, SS men dressed as Polish soldiers attacked the German radio station at Gleiwitz, broadcasting anti-German propaganda before retreating. The bodies of concentration camp prisoners, killed by lethal injection and dressed in Polish uniforms, were left as evidence of Polish aggression. This staged incident provided Hitler with his pretext for war. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, German forces crossed the Polish border along a front stretching from the Baltic to Slovakia. The Wehrmacht deployed 1.5 million men, 2,750 tanks, and 2,315 aircraft against Poland's 1.3 million soldiers, 880 tanks, and 435 aircraft. The myth of Polish cavalry charging German tanks has persisted in popular imagination, but the reality was both more complex and more tragic. Polish forces fought courageously against overwhelming odds, utilizing modern tactics and equipment where available, but they were simply outgunned and outnumbered. The German Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined concentrated armor, air power, and mechanized infantry in coordinated attacks that shattered traditional defensive lines. Stuka dive bombers serve as aerial artillery, their screaming sirens adding psychological warfare to their physical destruction. September 3, 1939. At 11:15 a.m., British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice crackled over BBC radio. "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." France declared war 6 hours later. World War II had begun. September 17, 1939. As Polish forces desperately held out against the German onslaught, hoping for Allied relief, the Soviet Union struck from the east. Stalin's Red Army crossed the Polish border with 466,000 troops, claiming they were protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. With enemies attacking from both sides, Polish resistance collapsed. The government fled to Romania, then to France, and eventually to London, where it would spend the war in exile. Warsaw, surrounded and bombed, held out until September 27th before surrendering. On September 28th, German and Soviet officials met to formalize the partition of Poland. The country that had just regained independence after 123 years of partition was divided once again. This fourth partition of Poland would prove to be the bloodiest in its history. While Poland was being crushed, Western Europe experienced what became known as the Phony War or Blitzkrieg. French forces, despite their declaration of war, launched only a limited offensive in the Saar region before withdrawing behind the Maginot Line, their supposedly impregnable fortress system along the German border. The British Expeditionary Force, 158,000 men strong, arrived in France and took positions along the Belgian border. Both sides settled in for what many expected to be a replay of World War I, a long war of attrition fought from fixed positions. The most aggressive action during this period was the dropping of propaganda leaflets over Germany. As one British politician sarcastically noted, the only thing they accomplished was providing the German people with toilet paper for the duration of the war. November 30th, 1939. The Soviet Union invaded Finland after manufactured border incidents. Stalin expected a quick victory over the small Nordic nation, but he had gravely miscalculated. The Finns, led by Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, put up fierce resistance. The Battle of Suomussalmi in December 1939 became a symbol of Finnish resistance. 2 Soviet divisions, over 45,000 men, were encircled and destroyed by Finnish forces numbering fewer than 11,000. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and Soviet soldiers, unprepared for the harsh conditions, froze in their positions. Finnish snipers, most famously Simo Häyhä, known as the White Death, terrorized Soviet forces. The Finns also popularized the Molotov cocktail, improvised incendiary devices named mockingly after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. After 3 months of embarrassing defeats, Stalin finally committed overwhelming force to the Finnish front. On March 12, 1940, Finland was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty, ceding 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union. Finland had fought valiantly, but had fought alone. April 9, 1940. Germany launched Operation Weserübung, the simultaneous invasion of Denmark and Norway. Hitler needed to secure Swedish iron ore shipments and prevent the Allies from cutting this vital supply line through Norwegian ports. Denmark fell within hours, offering only token resistance. Norway proved more challenging. German forces, using coordinated air, sea, and airborne assault, captured key Norwegian ports and airfields. It was the first time in military history that paratroopers were used to capture an enemy capital when German forces took Oslo's Fornebu airport. King Haakon VII and the Norwegian government rejected German demands to surrender and fled north to continue resistance. British, French, and Polish forces landed at Narvik and other points along the Norwegian coast, but their efforts were poorly coordinated and inadequately supplied. The Battle of Narvik saw fierce fighting between British and German naval forces. German destroyers were trapped in Narvik Fjord and systematically destroyed by the Royal Navy, but German mountain troops holding the town proved difficult to dislodge. By early June 1940, with France collapsing, Britain was forced to evacuate its forces from Norway. King Haakon VII and his government fled to London, and Norway fell under German occupation. The Norwegian campaign had cost Germany dearly in naval losses, but secured vital resources for the German war effort. The French had expected the German main attack to come through Belgium, as it had in 1914. Their Plan D called for the best Allied forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, to advance into Belgium to meet the German thrust. This played directly into German hands. The real German main attack came through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable to large, armored formations. General Heinz Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps, spearheading Army Group A, moved 41,000 vehicles through the supposedly impenetrable forest in just 3 days. French aerial reconnaissance spotted the massive traffic jam, but dismissed it as a diversion. May 13, 1940. German forces reached the Meuse River at Sedan, the site of France's humiliating defeat in 1870. Under cover of continuous Stuka attacks, German engineers built pontoon bridges while assault troops crossed in rubber boats. The French defenders, many of them reservists, broke under the relentless bombing and fled. By May 14th, German armor had broken through French lines and was racing toward the English Channel. The sickle-cut strategy devised by General Erich von Manstein threatened to trap the entire Allied force in Belgium and northern France. German panzer divisions raced across northern France with breathtaking speed. Guderian's tanks covered 50 miles on May 16th alone, faster than the French High Command could react. Communications broke down, and confusion reigned in Allied headquarters. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned Winston Churchill, who had just become British Prime Minister, with the devastating news: "We have been defeated. We are beaten." The French government began preparations to leave Paris, and millions of French civilians fled southward in what became known as the Exodus. May 20, 1940. German forces reached the Channel coast at Noyelles-sur-Mer, cutting off the Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, French First Army, and Belgian forces, nearly 400,000 men, were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. May 26, 1940. Operation Dynamo began the evacuation of Allied forces from Dunkirk. What had started as a military catastrophe was about to become one of the most remarkable rescue operations in history. Incredibly, Hitler issued a halt order to his advancing panzer divisions on May 24th, just as they were closing in on Dunkirk. This decision, influenced by Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could finish off the trapped forces, gave the Allies precious time to organize their defense. The Royal Navy commandeered every available vessel: destroyers, passenger ferries, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and even Thames river barges. This fleet of little ships began the dangerous journey across the Channel to rescue the trapped troops. The Luftwaffe launched devastating attacks on the crowded beaches, but RAF Fighter Command, operating from bases in southern England, contested every raid. The skies over Dunkirk became the first major battle of what would later be called the Battle of Britain. Between May 26th and June 4th, Operation Dynamo evacuated 338,226 men from Dunkirk, 198,229 British, and 139,997 French and Belgian troops. Though they had to leave behind all their heavy equipment, the core of Britain's trained army had been saved to fight another day. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons on June 4th. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." June 5, 1940. With the Northern Allied armies eliminated, Hitler launched Fall Rot, Case Red, the final assault on France. The Wehrmacht attacked south of the Somme with 104 divisions against the remaining 65 French divisions. June 10, 1940. Mussolini, seeing France's collapse, declared war on Britain and France. "I need a few thousand dead to sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought," he reportedly told his generals. Italian forces launched attacks on the French Alpine frontier, but achieved little against determined French resistance. June 14, 1940. German forces entered Paris. The City of Light, declared an open city to spare it from destruction, fell without a battle. The symbol of French civilization and culture was now in German hands. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun in World War I, became prime minister and immediately sought an armistice with Germany. The 84-year-old marshal believed that France was finished and that further resistance would only bring more suffering. June 22, 1940. In a calculated act of humiliation, Hitler insisted that the armistice be signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The ceremony took place in the forest of Compiègne, and afterward Hitler ordered the historic car to be taken to Berlin and the memorial to be destroyed. June 18, 1940. From London, a virtually unknown French general named Charles de Gaulle broadcast over BBC radio, "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." De Gaulle's call for resistance would inspire the French resistance movement and keep the spirit of free France alive. Marshal Pétain established the French state, with its capital at Vichy, in the southern zone left unoccupied by German forces. The Vichy regime would collaborate extensively with Nazi Germany, sending forced laborers to German factories and implementing anti-Semitic laws. July 3, 1940. To prevent the powerful French fleet from falling into German hands, the Royal Navy attacked French warships at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria. The attack killed 1,297 French sailors and severely damaged British-French relations, but it demonstrated Britain's determination to continue fighting alone if necessary. July 10, 1940. The Luftwaffe began its air campaign against Britain, officially marking the start of the Battle of Britain. Hermann Göring commanded 2,600 aircraft against RAF Fighter Command's 700 operational fighters. On paper, the odds seemed insurmountable, but Britain had secret weapons. The chain-home radar system, the world's first operational radar network, gave the RAF advance warning of incoming attacks. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had husbanded his fighter resources carefully, building an integrated air defense system that made the most of Britain's limited resources. The German strategy was to destroy the RAF through combat and bombing of airfields and aircraft factories. Once air superiority was achieved, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, could proceed. But Göring underestimated both the RAF's resilience and the complexity of achieving air superiority over a determined enemy. The battle raged through the summer of 1940. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, engaged in desperate aerial combat over the fields of southern England. The average life expectancy of an RAF pilot during the worst period of the battle was just 4 weeks. Churchill paid tribute to the RAF pilots on August 20th. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. September 7, 1940. The Luftwaffe shifted its strategy from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London. This change, prompted partly by an RAF raid on Berlin, would prove to be a fatal mistake. It gave Fighter Command's battered airfields time to recover while beginning the nightmare known as the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers pounded London. The East End, with its docks and working-class neighborhoods, suffered terribly. On December 29, 1940, incendiary bombs created a firestorm that threatened to destroy the city of London, but St. Paul's Cathedral emerged miraculously unscathed from the surrounding inferno. Londoners adapted to the nightly raids with remarkable resilience. Underground stations became vast air raid shelters, housing up to 177,000 people each night. Families would arrive early to claim spots on the platforms, creating underground communities complete with libraries, schools, and entertainment. November 14, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched a devastating raid on Coventry, dropping 500 tons of explosives and thousands of incendiary bombs on the medieval city. Coventry Cathedral was destroyed, and the term "to Coventry" entered the German vocabulary, meaning to utterly destroy a target. The Blitz spread beyond London to other British cities. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Belfast all endured heavy bombing. The Luftwaffe dropped 41,000 tons of bombs on Britain, killing 43,000 civilians and injuring 139,000 more. September 13, 1940. While Britain fought for its life, Mussolini opened a new front in North Africa. Italian forces from Libya invaded Egypt, seeking to capture the Suez Canal and drive the British from the Mediterranean. December 9, 1940. British forces under General Archibald Wavell launched Operation Compass, a limited counterattack that turned into a spectacular victory. In 2 months, 31,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops advanced 500 miles, captured 130,000 Italian prisoners, and destroyed 10 Italian divisions. October 28, 1940. Mussolini, jealous of Hitler's successes and seeking his own military glory, invaded Greece from Albania. But the Greeks, under General Alexandros Papagos, not only stopped the Italian offensive, but launched a counterattack that drove Italian forces back into Albania. Mussolini's failures in North Africa and Greece forced Hitler to divert resources to shore up his faltering ally. German forces would have to be sent to the Mediterranean, delaying other operations and ultimately contributing to Germany's strategic overextension. While Britain fought alone, the United States gradually moved from neutrality toward active support of the Allies. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, constrained by isolationist sentiment in Congress and among the American public, used creative interpretations of neutrality laws to aid Britain. September 2, 1940. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement gave Britain 50 aging American destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. It was a clear violation of neutrality, but Roosevelt presented it as a defensive measure for American security. March 11, 1941. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing America to lend or lease military equipment to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Churchill called it the most generous act in the history of any nation. Over the course of the war, Lend-Lease would provide $50 billion in aid to the Allies. August 14, 1941. Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly aboard warships off the coast of Newfoundland and issued the Atlantic Charter, outlining their vision for the post-war world. Though America was still officially neutral, the meeting demonstrated the growing partnership between the two English-speaking democracies. June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the largest military operation in history began. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, deployed 3.8 million troops, 3,350 tanks, 7,184 artillery pieces, and 1,945 aircraft against Stalin's Red Army. Hitler had always viewed the invasion of the Soviet Union as his ultimate objective. In Mein Kampf, he had written about the need for Lebensraum, living space, in the East. The Nazi-Soviet pact had been merely a temporary expedient, buying time while Germany dealt with the West. The invasion caught the Red Army completely unprepared. Despite numerous intelligence warnings, including from Britain and his own agents, Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would risk a two-front war. Soviet forces were in the midst of reorganization and modernization, with many units stationed far from the border, in peacetime formations. German forces advanced with devastating speed. Army Group North raced toward Leningrad, Army Group Center thrust toward Moscow, and Army Group South drove toward Kiev and Ukraine. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most still on the ground. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced up to 50 miles into Soviet territory. The Red Army, with 5.5 million men under arms, seemed to be disintegrating before the German onslaught. June 28, 1941. The fortress city of Brest-Litovsk, which had witnessed the signing of the separate peace between Germany and Russia in 1918, fell after heroic resistance. But across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, pockets of Red Army troops continued fighting, slowing the German advance and buying precious time. July 16, 1941. German forces encircled 300,000 Soviet troops in the Smolensk pocket. By August, over 700,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured in this operation alone. Hitler was jubilant, declaring that the Soviet Union had been struck down and will never rise again. But the Germans were beginning to face the reality of the Soviet Union's vast distances. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across primitive roads that turned to mud with every rainstorm. German vehicles, designed for European roads, broke down in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. September 8, 1941. German and Finnish forces completed their encirclement of Leningrad, trapping 2.5 million civilians and 200,000 soldiers in the former imperial capital. Hitler had declared that he wanted the city wiped from the face of the earth. The siege of Leningrad would become one of the most horrific episodes of the war. Cut off from food supplies, the city's inhabitants faced starvation. By November, the daily bread ration had been reduced to 125 grams, less than 5 ounces, per person. The road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga became the city's only lifeline. Trucks carrying supplies raced across the ice while German artillery and aircraft attacked the convoys. Many vehicles broke through the ice, their drivers and cargo lost forever in the frigid waters. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed during the siege, became a symbol of Leningrad's defiance. The premiere on August 9, 1942, was performed by starving musicians in the besieged city, broadcast around the world as a testament to human endurance. The siege would last 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. An estimated 1.1 million civilians died, most from starvation and disease. But Leningrad never fell. October 2, 1941. Operation Typhoon, the German assault on Moscow, began with 3 army groups converging on the Soviet capital. German commanders were confident they could capture the city before winter set in. October 16, 1941. Panic gripped Moscow as German forces approached within 40 miles of the city. Government offices were evacuated, and many officials fled to Kuibyshev. But Stalin remained in the Kremlin, his presence helping to steady Soviet resolve. The autumn rains turned Russian roads into quagmires, slowing the German advance to a crawl. General Mud, as German soldiers bitterly called it, succeeded where Soviet resistance had failed to stop the Wehrmacht. November 15, 1941. As temperatures dropped below freezing, the Germans launched their final assault on Moscow. German advance units came within sight of the Kremlin spires, but they could advance no further. December 6, 1941. Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched a massive Soviet counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter warfare, drove the Germans back from Moscow's gates. It was Hitler's first major defeat. December 7, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, they sank or severely damaged 18 warships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The attack was the culmination of months of rising tension between Japan and the United States. Japan's invasion of China in 1937 and its alliance with Nazi Germany had steadily worsened relations. American economic sanctions, including an oil embargo imposed in July 1941, had pushed Japan toward war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power better than most Japanese leaders and opposed war with the United States. But when ordered to plan for conflict, he designed the Pearl Harbor attack to achieve maximum psychological impact. The Japanese strike force, led by Admiral Tsuchinagumo, had approached Hawaii undetected. 6 aircraft carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves, achieving complete tactical surprise. American radar operators had detected the incoming planes but dismissed them as a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. December 8, 1941. President Roosevelt addressed Congress. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war with only 1 dissenting vote. The Pearl Harbor attack was only the beginning of Japan's coordinated assault across the Pacific. Within hours, Japanese forces were attacking American, British, and Dutch territories from the Philippines to Hong Kong. December 10, 1941. Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaysia. The loss of these capital ships shattered the myth of British naval supremacy in the Far East. December 25, 1941. Hong Kong fell to Japanese assault after 18 days of fierce fighting. The British garrison and Canadian reinforcements were overwhelmed by superior Japanese numbers and air power. February 15, 1942. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable Gibraltar of the East, surrendered to Japanese forces after a week-long siege. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 85,000 troops to Japanese General Tomoaki Yamashita, the largest capitulation in British military history. The Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies secured vital oil resources for the Japanese war machine. The Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, saw the destruction of the Allied naval force defending the East Indies. Within 3 months, Japan had conquered an area larger than the continental United States. April 9, 1942. American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines surrendered after months of desperate fighting. General Douglas MacArthur had been evacuated to Australia in March, promising, "I shall return," but 76,000 troops remained to face the Japanese. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. Japanese forces, unprepared for so many prisoners, forced the captives to march 65 miles in tropical heat without adequate food, water, or medical care. An estimated 10,000 men died during the march or in the camps that followed. May 6, 1942. The fortress island of Corregidor, last American stronghold in the Philippines, surrendered. General Jonathan Wainwright, left in command when MacArthur departed, became the highest-ranking American officer to be captured during the war. April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet 650 miles from Japan, struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, was militarily insignificant but psychologically devastating to Japan. The raid proved that the Japanese home islands were vulnerable to attack. The Japanese High Command, which had assured the emperor that this was impossible, was humiliated. More importantly, the raid prompted Japan to extend its defensive perimeter, leading to the fateful decision to attack Midway. May 4 to 8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first naval engagement in history fought entirely by aircraft. Neither fleet saw the other. All attacks were carried out by carrier-based planes. The Japanese sought to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would threaten Australia. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces to intercept the Japanese fleet. The battle was tactically a draw. Both sides lost one aircraft carrier, but strategically it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was turned back, and the carrier Shokaku was damaged and unable to participate in the upcoming Midway operation. June 4 to 7, 1942. The Battle of Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to destroy the remaining American Pacific Fleet by attacking Midway Island was undone by American code-breaking and tactical brilliance. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position his forces perfectly. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited northeast of Midway for the Japanese fleet. The battle began badly for the Americans. Torpedo squadrons launched from the American carriers were slaughtered by Japanese fighters, with Torpedo Squadron 8 losing all but one of its aircraft. But these attacks drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu simultaneously. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The 4th, Hiryu, was sunk later in the day. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 248 aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from this devastating defeat. August 7, 1942. American forces launched their first major offensive in the Pacific, landing on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The 6-month battle that followed would test American resolve and mark the beginning of Japan's long retreat. The Marines quickly seized Henderson Field, the partially completed Japanese airstrip that had prompted the invasion. But holding it proved far more difficult than taking it. For the next 6 months, Americans and Japanese fought desperately for control of this jungle island. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were among the fiercest of the war. The waters off the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships sunk there. The Japanese showed their mastery of night fighting, but American industrial superiority gradually wore them down. February 9, 1943. The Japanese completed their evacuation from Guadalcanal, ending the first major Allied victory against Japanese ground forces. The battle had cost Japan 2 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, and 600 aircraft. More importantly, it marked the beginning of Japan's defensive war. January 20, 1942. In a villa in Wannsee, outside Berlin, Nazi officials met to coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question. The Wannsee Conference, chaired by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, systematized the murder of European Jewry. The Holocaust had begun with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, but it escalated dramatically after the invasion of the Soviet Union. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, murdered over 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe, but this method was deemed too slow and psychologically damaging to the killers. The Nazis constructed 6 extermination camps in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These facilities were designed for one purpose: the industrial murder of human beings. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest killing center, capable of murdering 6,000 people per day. Jews from across Nazi-occupied Europe were transported in cattle cars under the pretense of resettlement. Upon arrival, the vast majority were immediately murdered in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. The scale of the Holocaust defied comprehension. By war's end, Nazi Germany and its collaborators had murdered 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable: Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and Soviet POWs. August 23, 1942. German 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, entered the outskirts of Stalingrad, the industrial city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's name. What followed would become the most decisive battle of World War II. The battle for Stalingrad became a house-to-house, room-to-room struggle. Soviet defenders, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, contested every building. The grain elevator changed hands multiple times, and fighting raged through the ruins of the tractor factory and Red October steelworks. Soviet snipers, most famously Vasily Zaitsev, terrorized German troops. Zaitsev alone was credited with 225 kills during the battle. His duel with German sniper Erwin Koenig became legendary, though Koenig's existence remains disputed by historians. November 19, 1942. While German forces remained bogged down in Stalingrad's ruins, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled the entire German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in what became known as the Kessel or Cauldron. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, but this proved impossible. The airlift could deliver only a fraction of the needed supplies, and German transport aircraft were shot down in increasing numbers. January 31, 1943. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the remnants of Sixth Army. Of the 250,000 men trapped in the Kessel, only 91,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. Of these, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat from the Soviet Union. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. October 23, 1942. British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, launched the Second Battle of El Alamein against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. After 12 days of fierce fighting, German and Italian forces were in full retreat. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein ended the Axis threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal. Churchill declared, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." November 8, 1942. Operation Torch saw American and British forces land in French Morocco and Algeria, opening a second front in North Africa. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the invasion force, marking America's first major commitment to ground combat in the European theater. The Vichy French forces initially resisted the landings, but agreed to a ceasefire after 3 days. Admiral François Darla, Vichy commander in North Africa, switched sides and ordered French forces to join the Allies, a decision that proved crucial to the operation's success. May 13, 1943. The last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered in Tunisia. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops entered Allied captivity, losses that Axis forces could not replace. North Africa was now in Allied hands, providing a launching pad for the invasion of Italy. July 5, 1943. Hitler launched Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The target was the Kursk salient, where 900,000 Soviet troops were concentrated in a vulnerable bulge in the line. The Germans assembled their most powerful force since Barbarossa: 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,050 aircraft. New weapons like the Tiger tank and Ferdinand tank destroyer were deployed in large numbers for the first time. But the Red Army was ready. Soviet intelligence had learned of German plans, and Marshal Zhukov had prepared the most elaborate defensive system in military history. 8 successive defensive belts, protected by 400,000 mines, awaited the German assault. July 12, 1943. The Battle of Prokhorovka saw the largest tank engagement in history, with over 800 tanks clashing on the rolling steppe. The Wehrmacht's elite SS Panzer Corps met the Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army in a day-long battle that left the field littered with burning armor. After 8 days, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. German forces had advanced at most 30 miles and had suffered irreplaceable losses in men and equipment. The initiative on the Eastern Front had passed permanently to the Red Army. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, began with the largest amphibious assault in history to that point. British Eighth Army and American Seventh Army, now commanded by General George S. Patton, landed on the island's southern coast. Italian resistance collapsed quickly, but German forces under General Hans-Valentin Hube conducted a skillful defense. Despite overwhelming Allied superiority, most German troops escaped to the Italian mainland when Sicily fell on August 17. July 25, 1943. The Grand Council of Fascism voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III ordered the Duce's arrest, and Marshal Pietro Badoglio became head of the Italian government. Secret negotiations with the Allies began immediately. September 3, 1943. British forces crossed the Strait of Messina and landed on the Italian mainland. The same day, the Italian government signed a secret armistice with the Allies, though this was not announced until September 8. September 9, 1943. American Fifth Army, commanded by General Mark Clark, landed at Salerno south of Naples. German forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring nearly drove the invaders back into the sea before naval gunfire and reinforcements saved the beachhead. The Germans, led by the brilliant General Heinrich von Weidinghoff, established the Gustav Line across the Italian peninsula. The monastery of Monte Cassino became the anchor of this defensive position, blocking the Allied advance on Rome. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, began in the pre-dawn hours as Allied airborne forces dropped behind German lines in Normandy. At 6:30 a.m., the largest amphibious assault in history commenced along 50 miles of French coastline. General Eisenhower had been given supreme command of the invasion, coordinating American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces. The planning for D-Day had taken over 2 years, involving elaborate deception operations to convince the Germans the invasion would come at Pas de Calais. On Omaha Beach, American forces faced their bloodiest ordeal. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions encountered withering fire from well-positioned German defenders. For several hours, the outcome hung in the balance as American soldiers struggled to gain a foothold on the cliffs above the beach. At Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword beaches, Allied forces achieved their objectives with lighter casualties. British and Canadian troops pushed inland, but their attempts to capture the key city of Caen were repulsed by determined German resistance. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops had been landed in France. The second front that Stalin had demanded for 2 years had finally been opened. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. June 23, 1944. 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa began, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that would destroy German Army Group Center and liberate much of Eastern Europe. The Soviet attack, involving 1.7 million men, caught the Germans completely off guard. Within 5 days, the Red Army had encircled and destroyed the German Fourth Army. The Wehrmacht's defensive line, which had held for 2 years, collapsed in spectacular fashion. July 3, 1944. Soviet forces liberated Minsk, capital of Belarus. The German Fourth Army and part of the Ninth Army, over 350,000 men, had been eliminated. It was the Wehrmacht's worst defeats in Stalingrad. The Red Army's advance continued with breathtaking speed. By the end of July, Soviet forces had reached the Baltic Sea, trapping German Army Group North in the Courland Peninsula. Poland's border was crossed, and the liberation of Eastern Europe had begun. August 25, 1944. General Charles de Gaulle entered Paris as the city was liberated by French and American forces. The German garrison, commanded by General Dietrich von Choltitz, surrendered rather than carry out Hitler's order to destroy the French capital. The liberation of Paris marked the effective end of German resistance in France. American and British forces had broken out of Normandy in late July, and by August, German Army Group B was in full retreat toward the German border. The French resistance, which had conducted sabotage operations throughout the occupation, rose in open revolt as Allied forces approached. The Paris Uprising, led by Colonel Henri Roll-Tanguy, began on August 19 and played a crucial role in the city's liberation. October 20, 1944. General MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return as American forces landed on Leyte Island in the Philippines. The invasion triggered the largest naval battle in history as the Japanese combined fleet made its final desperate attempt to stop the American advance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23 to 26, 1944, involved 282 warships and resulted in the virtual destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. For Japanese aircraft carriers, 3 battleships and numerous cruisers and destroyers were sunk. The Japanese introduced a new weapon of desperation, the kamikaze. Divine Wind Special Attack Units began systematically crashing their aircraft into American ships, inflicting significant casualties but failing to halt the American advance. December 16, 1944. Hitler launched his final major offensive in the West, attacking through the Ardennes forest where German forces had achieved such spectacular success in 1940. Operation Watch on the Rhine caught American forces completely by surprise. German forces advanced 50 miles in some sectors, creating a dangerous bulge in American lines. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne but refused to surrender. When asked to capitulate, General Anthony McAuliffe replied simply, "Nuts." The German offensive was Hitler's last gamble, using reserves that Germany could not afford to lose. When the attack was finally repelled in January 1945, the Wehrmacht had suffered losses it could not replace. The road to Germany now lay open. January 12, 1945. The Red Army launched its final offensive toward Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front advanced along a 300-mile front, devastating German defensive positions. Within 2 weeks, Soviet forces had advanced 300 miles and reached the Oder River, only 40 miles from Berlin. The German army in the east was collapsing, and millions of German civilians fled westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. March 7, 1945. American forces of the 9th Armored Division seized the bridge at Remagen, the last intact crossing over the Rhine River. Within 24 hours, 8,000 American troops had crossed into the heart of Germany. April 11, 1945. American forces liberated Buchenwald concentration camp, revealing to the world the full horror of the Nazi genocide. General Eisenhower, witnessing the camp's horrors firsthand, ordered extensive documentation to ensure the world would never forget. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, finding 60,000 prisoners in appalling conditions. Among the dead was Anne Frank, whose diary would become one of the most powerful testimonies to the Holocaust's victims. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, they uncovered camp after camp. The industrial scale of Nazi murder shocked even hardened soldiers. The liberation of the camps provided irrefutable proof of Nazi war crimes. April 12, 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, architect of the Allied victory, died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. Vice President Harry S. Truman, who had been kept largely uninformed about major wartime decisions, suddenly found himself leader of the most powerful nation on Earth. Truman would soon learn of the Manhattan Project and face the most momentous decision in human history. But first, he had to help finish the war that Roosevelt had led for nearly 4 years. April 16, 1945. The Battle of Berlin began as Soviet forces launched their final assault on the Nazi capital. Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to leave the city or surrender. The battle for Berlin was house to house, block by block fighting of extraordinary intensity. Hitler Youth and elderly Volkssturm militia fought alongside regular troops in a hopeless defense of the dying Reich. April 30, 1945. As Soviet forces closed in on his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide alongside his wife Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich had led Germany to total destruction in just 12 years. May 2, 1945. Berlin fell to Soviet forces. The Nazi regime that had terrorized Europe for 6 years was finally destroyed. May 8, 1945. At 11:01 p.m. Central European Time, the German surrender became official. In a school building in Reims, France, and later in Berlin, German military leaders signed the unconditional surrender that ended the war in Europe. Winston Churchill announced victory in Europe Day to the British people. Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m., at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and Grand Admiral Donitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe. Celebrations erupted across the Allied world, but the war was not yet over. In the Pacific, Japan continued to fight with fanatical determination. August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. In an instant, 70,000 people were killed, and a city of 350,000 was largely destroyed. The atomic age had begun. President Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb remains one of history's most controversial choices. Facing the prospect of Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, which military planners estimated would cost 1 million American casualties, Truman chose to use America's secret weapon. August 8, 1945. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with 1.5 million troops. The Guangdong Army, Japan's elite force in China, was crushed within days. August 9, 1945. A second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 people instantly. Emperor Hirohito, realizing that continued resistance would mean the annihilation of the Japanese people, decided to surrender. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast to the Japanese people. For the first time, most Japanese heard their emperor's voice as he announced their nation's defeat in language carefully chosen to avoid the word surrender. September 2, 1945. On the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives formally signed the instruments of surrender. General MacArthur, now Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan, presided over the ceremony. World War II was over. The most destructive conflict in human history had claimed an estimated 70 to 80 million lives and reshaped the global order. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers while Europe lay in ruins. The atomic age had begun, and the world would never be the same. 6 years after it began with the invasion of Poland, World War II had ended with the complete defeat of the Axis powers. The cost had been staggering. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians dead, entire cities destroyed, and nations torn apart. But from the ashes of this global catastrophe, a new world would emerge. The United Nations would be founded to prevent future wars. The Marshall Plan would rebuild Europe. The State of Israel would be established. The Cold War between former allies would begin. The generation that fought World War II would be called the greatest generation for their sacrifice and determination in humanity's darkest hour. They had faced the abyss and pulled the world back from the brink of barbarism. Their victory ensured that freedom and democracy would survive to fight another day. It was, in Winston Churchill's words, their finest hour. This has been the complete story of World War II, a war that changed everything, and whose lessons echo through history to this day. If you liked this documentary, please consider leaving a comment, liking the video, and subscribing to this channel. Thank you.